All right, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Anne Pisor. She's from Washington State University, and she's going to talk about parochial altruism. And the floor is all yours.
Okay. Great, thanks for having me. And good to meet you all. Many new faces out there, so I look forward to talking to you during the Q&A. So today I want to talk to you a bit about a paper that was just accepted with minor revisions at Evolution and Human Behavior. And it's a review paper titled exactly what you see here. So parochial altruism, what it is and why it varies. So intergroup conflict captures public and academic imaginations when it comes to humans. I don't have to tell you now that when we're talking about polarization, whether in Europe, the US, or in other countries, it's something that's very top of mind. And we see this both in the academic and non-academic literatures. We see popular books focused on warfare and focused on tribes and tribalism. We see lots of references to xenophobia, parochialism, etc. Now, the assumption that's often made, both inside and outside of the academic literature, is that outgroup hostility is the human default. And by hostility here, what I mean is that individuals are actively generating costs for outgroup members in one way or another. Now, this will be interesting, right? What we're going to talk a bit about today is how that assumption doesn't necessarily hold. And that can also show up in the methods we use. So first thing, what's often overlooked when we're thinking about intergroup conflict and how pervasive it is sometimes intergroup relations vary, and that's actually also very common. So here we're looking at a paper from Angelo Romano et al. 2017. I'll explain the methods in a bit for those of you that are interested. And what we see in this paper is that Angelo and co-authors looked at individual behavior across a number of different countries. And what they found is that in-group favoritism, that is willingness to generate, to actually send resources towards in-group members, in this case, money, varied substantially across countries, as you can see here looking at this variability. Now, what's key here is that this is in-group favoritism, right? So if we come back to the question raised in the previous slide, right, or the statement in the previous slide, the assumption is that outgroup hostility is the human default. Yet, in some of our more popular papers, for example, looking at intergroup behavior in humans, what we actually see is that researchers are measuring in-group favoritism only and not outgroup hostility. And this is going to be key here because right? Often we're making the assumption that outgroup hostility is a default for humans. So in this larger umbrella, under this larger umbrella of intergroup relationships in humans, there is an idea, a theory, I actually refer to it as, called parochial altruism. So this is something emerging largely from Samuel Bowles's writings, as well as those of his collaborators. And parochial altruism refers to in-group favoritism paired with out-group hostility. So it's the pairing of these two things, the coupling of these two things that's important. Now, parochial altruism, as written by Bowles and others, has really captured the public imagination. So some of the books that I showed you earlier on in the talk, for example, Moral Tribes by Joshua Green, really kind of leans into this idea of parochial altruism. So in fact, Robert Bohm says, parochial altruism has become a catch-all term for a variety of intergroup biases. Basically, sometimes when we mean intergroup conflict, when we mean favoring in-group, but not necessarily anything about the outgroup, we still call it parochial altruism. Now, again, coming back to this earlier paper I mentioned by Angelo Romano et al., we see this focus on in-group favoritism. So in Angelo's paper, and again, I'm just using his paper as an example. If you know him, then you'll know that he does really good work. But what happens in this 2017 paper is that the authors focus on the trust game. And for a number of you, the trust game will be familiar. So in the trust game, what you do is you give an allocation of monetary units, right, of coins or dollars or euros to a decider, right, someone who's in the decider role. And you say you can send any amount of this money, if you so choose, to a recipient. And that recipient, right, will receive that amount of money, in this case, times 3. So if I send 1 monetary unit, they will receive 3. The question then becomes for the recipient, how much money to return. So oftentimes we talk about trusting behavior and trustworthiness in the context of the trust game. Now, if we're trying to measure something like parochial altruism, so in-group favoritism paired with out-group hostility, the trust game falls short of measuring these two concepts. This is for a couple of reasons. So first of all, there's no real opportunity for hostility. If you're the recipient, you can choose to not return money, but it's unclear that that actually captures this concept of generating costs for out-group members. Choosing not to return may instead signify lack of generosity, right? And that's open to debate. Further, in this particular paper, the assumption is that individuals are often from two different groups. So the recipient may or may not be from the same country as the decider or from a different country. And the authors treat this as kind of an in-group, out-group distinction. But the question then, of course, becomes whether country boundaries are salient for the decider, right? As many of you know who live outside of your country of origin, we often are moving countries, or we may often have friendships with people from other countries. So how salient is that boundary? It's unclear. So PA, as I'm calling it, or parochial altruism, varies. But the extent to which it varies may depend on a couple of different things. First of all, it may vary empirically, right? We may actually see real empirically measurable variation in parochial altruism across countries, across cultures, across individuals. But additionally, that variation may reflect variation in researchers' methods, right? Which ways we choose to measure parochial altruism, and even in some of the assumptions we make. So what I'd like to do is kind of give a broad overview of these three sources of variability. And these are all overviewed here in the preprint for this accepted with minor revisions paper. And so I'll show the QR code here. I'll show it a few more times during the talk. If you decide you want to follow along, feel free. But what we'll do is we'll move through here first researcher expectations. Then we'll talk a bit about the net benefits, so the relative costs and benefits of parochial altruism. And then we'll talk a bit about methodology and how that impacts measures. So already you heard that researcher expectations can matter when it comes to our expectations about how the world is structured. So quoting here again, Robert Bohm, right? We have parochial altruism, as he says, has become a catch-all term for a variety of intergroup biases. Now, researcher expectations can reflect this, right? That reflects the world we see and what we expect to measure as researchers when we're doing science. But another example of how researcher expectations can impact the way we do our work is, for example, we may choose to conduct research in contexts that are actually known for intergroup conflict. So here, pulling a quote from Marilyn Brewer, has a nice paper overviewing intergroup conflict in 2010. She says, the salience and extremity, if you will, of intergroup hostility, that is how much it appears in the news, how much we see it in our everyday lives, can then impact the study of intergroup relations so that it becomes equivalent to the study of intergroup conflict. And as we know already, as we've established, intergroup relations in humans are very flexible. Now, when I was doing my PhD research, got caught up in this idea of intergroup conflict and wanted to study it. So I did my field research in Bolivia, in the lowlands of Bolivia in the Amazon basin. And I was really interested in intergroup dynamics in Bolivia for a few reasons. So first of all, I'd been exposed to a lot of what was going on at the time in the evolutionary literature, especially evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary psychology, and these ideas that intergroup conflict really structured human evolution, really structured human sociality. And so I went to Bolivia to study this because in Bolivia, the Constitution recognizes 36 different pueblos indígenas, so different indigenous groups, and recognizes the rights of each of those groups to basically decide how they want to punish people, how they want to govern day-to-day living, etc. And so I was interested in how groups either did or did not engage in, say, relationships with one another or in conflict with one another. And I studied this with three different groups. The two on the right, so the Moseten and the Chimane, those are pueblos indígenas. So they're recognized by the federal government as having all those kinds of independent rights. And I also worked with this group called the Interculturales, which is a mix of different indigenous groups. And I was interested in the extent to which you saw intergroup conflict versus intergroup ties across these different three populations. And my idea was that, if individuals are managing risk, whether it's coming from markets or coming from ecology, they might have more incentive to build relationships across group boundaries. So that's what I expected to find. And what we did is we created a game for measuring this, right? And by game here, of course, I mean an economic experiment. This is coming, for those of you familiar, right, from behavioral economics or coming from experimental economics. And here what we did, which is going to prove problematic, is we created a game from scratch. It came up during a lab group one day. We said, okay, this is how we're going to measure it. And so what we wanted to measure, of course, was this kind of trade-off between in-group relationships and out-group relationships. And the method I'm about to describe works well for the trade-off in investment. Maybe I want to have more in-group friends than out-group friends, but it doesn't work so well for measuring parochial altruism. So what I did is I showed individuals 6 photos, 3 on the left from one group, 3 on the left from another. What's key here is I actually asked individuals what groups mattered to them. So I asked which groups they felt were most indicative of their identity. So which one you felt like you belonged to most, and I used that as their in-group. And groups they felt they belonged to least, I used as their out-group. So already trying to move past assumptions about which groups mattered for cooperation and which ones didn't. And I made sure everybody was a stranger. So I asked, do you know anybody in any of these 6 photos? And then I left coins, right? Each one worth about 14 cents in US dollars across each of these photos. So 3 coins on each and 3 coins in front of the participant. And I said, okay, I'm going to walk away. And you can do whatever you want. You can move coins between photos, you can take coins for yourself, or you can give coins to photos. When you're done, tell me, I'll come back. And any coins that you leave on top of a photo, it's going to go to that participant at the end of the field season. Now, for those of you who think about games, right, there's a lot of assumptions already baked into this. There's a delay between when the participant gives money and when the other one receives it. So you can think about temporal discounting here. There's some assumptions in terms of the zero-sum game, right? If you give more to in-group members, you give less to out-group members. Works better for parochial altruism, but we're not quite all the way there. And then additionally, I walk away, which has impacts too, right, on participant behavior. So here, what's key is that recipients are not anonymous, and the decider is not anonymous either. Our hope was that this game would capture basically willingness to be generous and get credit for it towards an out-group member. And what that would do, in theory, is actually forge a new relationship, right? Something that hadn't been there before. So an opportunity to build that connection. And further, of course, right, recipients are not anonymous. They're getting credit for what they've done. So, well, how did people behave in this game? Again, we're thinking about Tsimane, Most of 10, and interculturals. And what do we actually see in terms of behavior? So the figure I'm showing you here is the average amount of Bolivianos. Bolivianos are those coins. So each coin here we'll just say is worth 1 on this scatter plot. Average of Bolivianos given to outgroup members, right? So average given to each person on a photo who is an outgroup member. First of all, you'll remember that there were originally 3 coins on each photo. So you can see a little bit of clustering here around 3. These are individuals who were largely unwilling to move coins, right? And basically what I'd done is I'd given a framing of fairness. And so some individuals who really valued fairness were unwilling to move coins. What's also key here is, unlike some previous methods, this frames things towards outgroup giving. So 82% of individuals gave at least something to outgroup members. And oftentimes in different methods we might use in different experimental contexts, we see less outgroup giving. But something else you'll notice here is Tsimane over here gave basically less to outgroup members. In fact, you can see here that perhaps the modal amount of giving is 0. So Tsimane had the highest in-group favoritism by taking coins and moving it to in-group members and away from outgroup members' photos. Now, there's more to this story than just, the names intercultural, Most of 10, and Tsimane, right? What's key here is that intergroup competition varies across these 3 populations. And For Chimane, especially, discrimination and inequality make group membership salient. So when I ask, I'm an anthropologist, right? So I like to ask people about their perceptions of things, about how things are working in terms of intergroup relationships for them. And what I found is that when I said, which groups have more, which groups have less, tell me what people say about these groups, Chimane were basically kind of considered to be bottom of the social ladder. People look down on Chimane, and that was something they were very well aware of, right? It's not something that they didn't know. And so ethnographic reports of group status had Chimane at the bottom below Mosaten and interculturals. And so this, for Chimane participants, when I asked them, kind of really framed things in the game and in the real world in terms of intergroup competition. These groups over here have more and are more powerful, right, have higher status, and we have less. And so that really made group membership salient in a way for Chimane. I think that it did not for Mosaten and intercultural participants. Now, what's key here, of course, is what is a group. So remember that I asked participants, what is your group membership? Which groups do you associate with more versus less? I asked them about their Pueblo Indígena, their indigenous group. I also asked them about religion. I asked them about work cooperatives. But which group we're talking about actually makes a pretty big difference. And this is something that's often lost in the intergroup literature. So I'm pulling a figure here from Cristina Moya. She recently had a paper come out that was focused on, what is a group basically, and why does it matter? This exact same question. So we're thinking about it at the same time. And what she does is she basically takes a few different examples of groups, some of them more ancestral, as she puts it, so like gender and age, and some groups that are more novel, right, more recent. So things like occupation and class that showed up more recently in human evolutionary history. And she basically says, look, we shouldn't expect coordination and cooperation to occur naturally, occur easily along all of these different group boundaries. We should actually see them more among ethnic groups, for example, than we do among, say, gender groups or age groups. So we shouldn't expect all kinds of groups to reliably structure cooperative behavior. And that was a big assumption I made, right? I assumed ethnic groups would structure behavior. I made that assumption because of the literature, but countries, for example, may not structure it as much, or we may find that, as we'll come back to later, groups we create in experiments may not structure cooperation as much. So asking people what groups matter to them and focusing on groups likely to matter, given our knowledge of how cooperation tends to be structured, can really help us focus research on intergroup relationships and parochial altruism specifically. That is, to really understand intergroup dynamics, it really helps us to specify what groups we think matter and why. So coming to the second part of the talk, so what are the different things that modulate benefits and costs when it comes to parochial altruism, and how might that impact variation in measured parochial altruism across contexts? So what we do in the paper is we try to really kind of break down different upstream variables that can impact parochial altruism. So a lot of times when we talk about intergroup conflict, right, we're really focused on behavior, say, in economic experiments or behavior in contexts of warfare in the real world. But of course, upstream of that behavior, there's lots of different things that can modulate it. So for example, we often make the assumption in behavioral experiments and behavioral economics that internal states like preferences, which I know is a fraught word, right? But you can also think about motivations and sentiments, how those internal states actually affect behavior. But additionally, if we go further upstream, we can think about how things like context and individual characteristics can either impact behavior directly or indirectly via internal states. So in the previous section of the talk, we discussed, for example, how experiences of discrimination may impact internal states for Chimane participants, right? How they kind of visualize and think about outgroup members and how that may affect their behavior in the context of that economic experiment. So another example I want to give here is how context can impact internal states and behavior. And I'll give a couple examples of that. So the first example is that of inequality. So again, thinking about discrimination and the haves and have-nots for Tsimane versus other groups, right? We see this potential incentive structure favoring intergroup competition because of unequal resource distribution. And this is something that's interestingly kind of baked in to the current political structure in Bolivia. So if you are a group, for example, who lives on your traditional native land, you actually have a right to more resources and more independence in decision-making than if you do not. So the interculturals, for example, will often talk about how they actually receive less investment and less recognition than, say, Tsimane or Mosaten. So coming back to the Tsimane case here, and again, this kind of perception of unequal resource distribution, which in their case reflects reality, what we can see is that if we look at market participation, this really seems to be impacting Tsimane behavior in these economic experiments. So let me unpack this figure. So what I did is I looked at market items owned, which in these populations can be a good proxy for wealth. For Tsimane, I asked whether each household had a list of items, right? We go through the list and I say, do you have a generator? Do you have a TV? Do you have a bed, right? These are things that can reflect wealth. And each population had its own separate list. So the things that mark wealth for interculturals are different from the things that mark wealth for Tsimane. And so what I then did is normalized those values for Tsimane, Mosaten, and intercultural. So we're looking at z-scores here. And I want to just look at this edge, this side of the distribution. So down here, right, looking at z-scores, we're below 0, right? And I want to show you just this part here and what is happening with Tsimane, Mosaten, and interculturals. So we're looking at predicted Bolivianos given to outgroup participant recipients, right, to each recipient, what are they receiving on average? And these are predicted values coming out of the models themselves, right? So you can see there's a lot of uncertainty in how much is going to be given. But generally here with Tsimane, you see this downward trend. So the more market items an individual owns, the less likely they are to give coins to outgroup members in this experiment. Now, there could be a few reasons for this. So first, it could mean that you actually have transmission of norms of keeping money to yourself and not sharing it with others. What doesn't match with this, though, is Tsimane were still very likely to give money to in-group members. That could be a product of the game, right? The game is really structuring in a lot of assumptions about how money can be allocated and about generosity. But at the same time, you might expect individuals to keep all the coins for themselves, right? Since they could do that. And we don't see that. Instead, what we see is that individuals are moving coins from outgroup member to in-group member photos, in this case, away from, say, interculturals and Mosaten to Tsimane, as individuals have more market items. And our interpretation of this, right, is that as individuals are exposed more to discrimination by dint of going to the market, interacting with outgroup members when you go to the market, you know, basically people look at a lot of Tsimane participants funny, is the way the participants tell me when they're in town, that then impacts their perceptions of outgroup members. So changing the actual or perceived unequal resource distribution, changing discrimination can actually impact, right, parochial altruism, assuming that's what we're measuring with this game. Institutions matter too, right? I don't have to tell folks here that, you know. And some things that matter in Bolivia are pretty interesting. So in the context of the Tsimane, interculturals, and Mosaten, migration and social connections can actually move norms between different groups and between locations. So let's focus just here on the interculturals. So the intercultural population is largely folks who have moved from the Andes to the Amazon. And in the Andes, folks have a lot of different norms for doing things. This is really common in Quechua and Aymara populations. And these things are things we see operating even in the lowlands. These institutions have moved with people. So one of these, for example, is this I'll go ahead and call it an institution instead of a norm, but of Aini. So this is this idea of reciprocal help between neighbors. What happens, for example, is when rice comes in as a crop, rice tends to be ready all at once, and it's a lot to harvest just for one family. So you have families coming to help each other harvest rice and then taking turns across days. I help you harvest rice today, you help me harvest rice tomorrow. We also see nested systems of social organization. If you look, for example, at leadership in the intercultural community, there's like 60 different leaders for a community of 1,000 people. So there's a lot going on there. And these are nested systems. So you have leaders at lower positions who are then responsible to people at the next level up, et cetera. And this is somewhat reflective of this system of Ayu from the Highlands. So you tended to see in the past these larger extended families nested within moieties. So you have these networks of families that have common ancestry. And this was used to actually organize cooperation, right? So you get this hierarchical structure with leaders at different levels who then cooperate on a larger scale. We also see institutions of egalitarian ethics, right? These ideas of who should share with whom and how much they should share. And finally, this idea of whether to share money or not. So this is pretty important, especially in the context of economic experiments, is that, for example, if you are from an intercultural community, sharing food is more normative, sharing money is a little bit different, right? So currency matters, whether we're talking about food, money, childcare, that affects how much sharing is happening. So coming back to this figure, right? Norms for sharing money are upstream of parochial altruism behavior. Here, what we've just reviewed is that context, for example, so what institutions are present, in this case, say norms for sharing money, that can actually then impact internal states. If I get some money, I'm not necessarily going to share it, which can then impact behavior, say, in this case, in an economic experiment. So what we can do is, as we're thinking about why there's variability in parochial altruistic behavior in the real world, we can think about how different upstream variables then impact that measured behavior and why. So again, another source of variation when it comes to parochial altruism are the methods we choose to use. And again, that's something I ran into myself when I used that game in the past, right? So if we think about the trust game, for example, or we think about this game that I created for my dissertation research, both of them implicitly are really focusing on in-group favoritism. And again, that's really common in the literature for intergroup conflict. And that's not to say, again, if you've done that, I've done it too, right? But to really think about what we need to do with games to actually measure parochial altruism, if that's what we intend to measure. So what kinds of methodological design actually test the linkage of in-group favoritism and out-group hostility? And before I go further, just as a note, if you do look at our preprint, we have a whole table kind of laying out the pros and cons of different methods for measuring parochial altruism with key citations. So that could be a good resource if you're curious. So I'm going to give you two examples of things here that have been used pretty successfully, at least in my opinion, for measuring parochial altruistic behavior using, say, experimental methods or just methods you can get with survey research. So the first one uses kind of a typical experimental context where you actually create games in the experiment itself. So you may have heard again of the minimal group paradigm. So this is this idea that humans are so groupish, right? We have a psychology that's so sensitive to groups that if you actually bring people into an experimental context and assign them a group membership, you can already start to see some of this group behavior in this context. What's nice about doing a minimal group experiment is that if people are behaving groupishly in that experiment, you might think they would do even more so in the real world, particularly when group membership is salient. And when you are talking about a kind of group, say like an ethnic group, that tends to structure cooperation. So this example here is from Aldering and Bohm. So we're looking at an intergroup parochial and universal cooperation game, so the IPUC, and it's in their 2019 paper on the subject. So a participant comes into an experimental context, and what you do is you assign them to a group. And the group has, in this case, kind of a meaningful, or not a meaningful, I should say, designation. So either group A or group B, or in this case, say, I'm just naming them group 1 and group 2. You need to have at least 2 people in each group to make the IPUC work. Now, these are all strangers and they're anonymous to each other. So again, this is an important feature of the design. So then to this participant over here, right, they know they're in group 1, you give them an allocation of coins here. We're going to call the allocation G. And this participant then has to decide how to allocate coins to say, a number of different potential categories here. And in this particular game, you have the options of A, B, or C, right? So there's 3 different ways that you can give money. So under decision A, basically what happens is that the individual can, say, choose to give a certain amount of money to A, right? And the amount that she gives to A, the amount of G here, I really simplified the mathematical terms, so go to the paper if you want to see all the details, is multiplied by a multiplier, right? So a little bit like the trust game here, the multiplier is K, and then divided among N people. So if your in-group has 2 people in it, and you give, G dollars to it, multiply that by K, and then divide it by 2. Now, the participant can also give some of their amount G to decision B here, right, to category B. And under category B, you get a multiplier again for in-group members, but you can also actually harm the out-group here. So if I choose to give to my in-group, I'm actually now being hostile to the out-group. And how that's working is the amount of money I give to B, right? And in this B, sorry, I'm being a little unclear here, but in this B designation, that's going to be multiplied by L, right? So certain multiplier, and that's going to then be deducted from the N players in the out group, right? So L times G divided by N, each player is going to get that amount of penalty for the amount put into B. And then C here, right? The participant can choose to put some money in C, and C goes to everybody. So you have a multiplier M, it's higher than the multipliers K or L in this case, that is multiplied by G and then divided among everyone in both groups. So forgetting the math here for a second, in this first condition, you have pure in-group favoritism. In the second condition, you have in-group favoritism paired with out-group hostility. And then in this third pile, you can give money to, everybody benefits. So you can basically be cooperative with everyone in the experiment. So this method, the IPUC, actually helps to pull apart in-group favoritism from parochial altruism, and also enables individuals to be cooperative with everyone if they choose to do so. Because again, game design really matters, and if participants are motivated to do C, we want to make sure we capture that. Now, this is all within the experimental context, right? When we're talking about the IPUC, this is all a minimal group paradigm. It's happening in the lab, but we may be interested in what's going on in the real world, as we sometimes call it, right? So maybe you're interested in how participants are behaving with respect to one another if they already are in groups. For example, if you're working in Bolivia, or in the case of my co-author, Cody Rost, right, in the context of Colombia. So using games, right, and an approach called the rich approach, a rich game. So it shouldn't say that rich there. It should say recipient identity conditioned heuristic games, right? So rich games actually enables you to look at how participants feel with respect to one another in the context of an experiment. So I'm using the word experiment here loosely. We're not actually assigning anyone to any conditions, but what you do is you basically show participants photos of members of their community. And some of these individuals will be in-group members, some will be out-group. Everyone's kind of mixed up into one big photo board. There's 3 different games in the rich approach here. So for example, we have the rich allocation game, we have the rich taking or leaving game, and the exploitation game. So let me just talk to you about these 2. So the allocation game, basically you give a participant a stack of coins and they can put coins across photos, and each coin that is on a photo goes to that person. And you also can have, say, the rich exploitation game. And the way this works is that you can actually put coins across photos, and then you can actually move those coins, take those coins, et cetera, right? So you can actually take things from participants. So what this enables participants to do is basically show experimenters, right, how they feel about other individuals. That's the idea, at least. So you can look at both generosity in the top row here, but in the bottom row, you can look at the willingness to actually generate costs for other participants. And this can be particularly powerful if you also look at things like identity. So who do you identify with? Who are you friends with? Who have you shared food with? And so you can also get, for example, peer ratings. So who you like, who's been kind. We're looking at that here in the bottom row. Additionally, you can look at dyadic tie nominations, right? So these are individuals with whom you have a relationship of sharing food or of being friends. And so what rich games enable you to do is look at how features of the dyad, features of the group, and features of the individual actually impact behavior that's consistent with parochial altruism. So in-group favoritism and out-group hostility. Okay, so coming back to the original question, parochial altruism varies, but to what extent is that empirical variation, say that in the benefits versus costs of parochial altruism, things that people are responding to, right? Versus variation in either our assumptions as researchers or in the methods that we're choosing to use. So to what extent might this be researcher expectations? A couple things I highlighted were, first of all, that what a group is matters, right? So we need to be kind of specific about what we mean by groups. A minimal group is very different than an ethnic group. You should have different expectations as a researcher about how much in a minimal group versus an ethnic group will actually structure cooperation or structure conflict in this case. What group actually matters to individuals also is important, right? So I may be a member of an ethnic group. This is often the case in Tanzania, for example. Folks are members of ethnic groups, but they're not very salient. And so if ethnic group membership doesn't really matter to folks, you wouldn't expect it to structure cooperation or conflict. And additionally, thinking about why groups matter should give us insight into human psychology, right? So not all groups may be equally important to individuals if we were to make just a priori predictions about that. Intergroup conflict is plastic, so flexible. So despite common characterizations, we know that humans can be both very cooperative with members of other groups and also very conflictual. And so thinking about how that varies and why is pretty important. So if we expect all groups to be involved in conflict, that may be what we find when we conduct our experimental research. So biases there can be key. So to what extent do the net benefits of parochial altruism, that is real world kind of empirical sources of increases in benefits or costs, to what extent does that impact parochial altruism? So what I've suggested here is we can think about how things upstream of parochial altruistic behavior modulates what happens downstream, be that institutions, be that past experiences, or even something like contexts that favor intergroup competition over resources. And that can help us think through, right, what might actually increase or decrease parochial altruism in the real world. So again, thinking about individual differences can be key, context can be key as well. And then finally, thinking about the extent to which methods used impact parochial altruism, right, or what we measure at least. We can think about techniques that work better to measure characteristics in question. Again, I will just use my own past approach as an example of what not to do. In-group favoritism doesn't get us all the way there for thinking about parochial altruism, right? Especially in the sense that that Sam Bowles was talking about it in the early 2000s. So trying to find techniques that can better measure those characteristics are important. And we have a couple here I highlighted, the IPUC and the rich games that can get us closer to actually measuring parochial altruism. And if you want pointers for how to design games, many of you, right, will not need this. You're very in that world already, especially if you're trying to do games in a field context, which can be pretty difficult. A lot of the experimental controls are often absent. We, Cody Ross, who's a co-author here, and I, and Ben Perzicki and Matt Gervais, we provide some pointers in this paper for how to design games that match research questions. And so if you want some ideas, want to think through that, feel free to check out that paper. So with that, I'm finishing a little early, so hopefully lots of time for discussion. I'd like to thank the Mosatan, Chimani, and Interculturals for their friendship, for their cooperation even over the course of years of field research, a number of people in Bolivia for their support, and then my co-authors and funders. And if you're interested in any of the preprints or papers I talked about today, if you're interested in my lab or you want to talk to me on Twitter, feel free to see these links. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Let me stop the recording and then we will go to the discussion.